So powerful.
So the theme of one of the themes of this morning's service was rocks, stones, and I saw I saw a cairn, what to me appeared like a cairn at the end of the children's hour, and that reminded me of hiking, which I love. And I brought along part of Mother Nature here to point out things that might be of importance on my slides. So this is going to be like a cairn, a pathway for coping with what we have every summer, the Gainesville oven. I'm trying to advance it. Can you do the? Yeah. Why don't you just advance the slides for me? Yeah. And there are two terms that I'm going to be using this morning, and I want to clarify what they are. Climate change is the long-term shift in temperature, rainfall, and a whole bunch of other weather parameters due to human activity. And this all became apparent. Climate change became apparent back in 1957 when a professor from the University of California, San Diego, called Roger Revelle, presented a paper using carbon-14 dating that showed that the increased atmospheric carbon dioxide has been arising from the burning of fossil fuels. And he gave a talk to Congress, and it was written up in the newspapers, and that was really the our first big awareness, a wake-up call, so to speak, for climate change. And next slide. And if you look at the chart of our temperatures, these are global average temperatures, global temperature average, day and night over the entire globe. And we use this period between 1880 and 1910 as a baseline. You can see how our temperatures across the entire planet have been rising. Now, there are a lot of other weather parameters that have changed, but I'm going to focus, I have to focus my talk just on temperature. So if you're interested in other things, we can talk about that later. Next slide. Now, the other concept that I want you to understand, and I'll be referring to this during the talk, is weather attribution science. This is involving specific weather events. And it's the study of the probability that human influence has contributed to a particular local weather event. And usually this is in terms of probability, like 2 times more probable, 4 times more probable, or whatever. And this was first demonstrated much more recently in 2004 by a bunch of British scientists, both working for the government and working for Oxford University, by the name of Stott, Stone, and Allan. And they, by that time, by 2004, had been collecting a lot of data on Europe as well as other places that allowed them to make statistical probabilities. And I hear Raymond's ear perking up now. As to a specific weather event. And if any of you were in Europe in the summer of 2003, that's when the event happened, there were tens of thousands of people who died from heat exposure in Europe. And in their paper, they demonstrated how the probability that heat wave in Europe in 2003 was doubled. The probability was doubled by human influence. Next slide. So if we look at the world, now this is on data from the Climate Central in Princeton, New Jersey. Red is like 5 times more probable that a weather event is due to human influence. And you notice right along the center part of the equator, and Florida, it includes here in a large area in the Southwest. This is the average temperature for July. July of last summer was the single hottest month in the recorded history. So it's here among us, and you can see the areas in Southeast Asia, Northern Australia, a lot of Central America and Northern South America, and the Near East, Mid-East is also subject to these heat waves. Next slide. Now, these are recent events. I like to look at human beings as something that has a biologic evolution. And for that, I want to focus on the heat dissipation mechanisms that we have. And we need to go back 65 million years, a long time ago, in the beginning of the Cenozoic era, when things were much warmer, about 10 to 15 degrees warmer Fahrenheit, 10 to 15 degrees warmer than what it is now. And that's when the Cenozoic period is often referred to by biologists as the era of mammals, as opposed to the era of reptiles when it was even warmer that preceded the Cenozoic era. So 2.6 million years ago, well into that period where we had the development of mammals, our primate ancestors began to start walking on 2 legs instead of 4 legs. And this was at the beginning of what we call the Quaternary period, where the planet was cooling down. And unlike previous eras, we were now developing solar ice caps, polar ice caps, and glaciers, and a much cooler environment. In the Quaternary period, throughout until recently, it's been 2 to 13 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than it is now. And this is over a period of 2.5 million years when we were developing our ways to dissipate our heat as warm-blooded creatures. And to maintain their body temperature, these primitive hominids descended from the trees, became bipedal, and began hunting high-calorie game on the run. So this was a big change. The mammals before this period were in warmer areas. So when it got colder, we had to increase our caloric intake to stay warm, to maintain our body temperature. So we had to turn from gathering nuts and fruit to gathering game. And to do that, we had to run them down. And naturally, when we started running our game down, we overheated by exertion of our muscles. And our chimpanzee friends have to stop and pant to cool their body temperature. But humans developed another mechanism. Next slide. Oh, this just gives more characteristics of the Quaternary period. So over this long period of 2 million years, or about 100,000 generations, it took for us to develop our sweat glands, of which we have about 1 or 2 million sweat glands on our body. Before this, all we had were the apical glands at the base of our hair follicles, under our arms, in our groin, on our scalp and stuff. So next slide. Instead of the apical glands were not effective heat dissipating mechanism, but sweat glands could generate a large amount of water, primarily, which with the heat of evaporation cooled the body. And so humans have 10 times the number of sweat glands as our nearest primate relative, the chimpanzee. And we don't have to stop and pant as long as we can perspire. Next slide. Now here's the problem. Our sweat glands, our eccrine sweat glands, can generate 2 quarts of perspiration per hour. That's even before you're acclimatized. If you're acclimated, you can develop 3 quarts you can sweat out 3 quarts of water an hour. Now that's pretty good. That's effective cooling as long as you're not in a high humid environment. But the problem is that humans can only absorb 1 quart of water per hour through your gastrointestinal tract. And we can't run around with an IV. I mean, that's the only other way to keep up with this, with an intravenous fluid. Now, we have to rely on our reserve of water. We have 14 quarts of water in our extracellular fluid, some of which is available over a period of time. About a third of this is in our bloodstream. But once the available fluid there is utilized, our body starts warming up, our muscles start cramping, we start decreasing the blood flow to our brain, we get dizzy and nauseated, our capillaries on the surface of our skin start collapsing, and our body temperature rises, and we develop heat exhaustion or other more serious heat illnesses. Next slide. Now here's the existential question. Using heat dissipation mechanisms that developed over a period of 100,000 generations at colder temperatures, how can we cope with the recent rise in global temperatures that developed over a period of just 2 generations? Yeah. So I'm going to help you cope. And there are 7 mechanisms we want to go through: maximizing your perspiration, dressing for comfort, avoiding toxic medicines, knowing your weather, and knowing your personal limits of tolerance, rescheduling your routines, relocating your residence, and finally, legislating sensibly. Next slide. Now, to maximize our perspiration, we have to expose ourselves to hot environments. And we need to do this in a gradual way over a period of several weeks. And during that time frame, we need to avoid becoming dehydrated and avoid becoming heat exhausted. And so the CDC has some guidelines: heat exposure while active 2 hours a day for 7 to 14 days. Now, NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, also has some guidelines that they advise for workers to expose themselves not more than 20% of their workday to heat on day 1, and then increase that percentage. So by the end of 5 days, a healthy, robust person should be better acclimated to the heat. Now, one of the things with acclimatization or acclimation, the terms are synonymous. Without heat exposure, you're not able to maintain this increase in the rate of perspiration that you can acquire. If you're not exposed to heat, it begins dissipating within 1 week, and within a month, it's gone. You have to start the process all over again from day 1. Now, you can increase somewhat your physical activity if you're been exercising aerobically and you're basically in better physical condition. Your heat tolerance improves, and that's primarily because your muscles are operating more efficiently. So you can do this, what you did before, with less expenditure of energy. Next slide. Now, another mechanism for coping is to dress comfortably. And the key to dressing comfortably is to wear a fabric that will wick the perspiration to the surface of the inner surface, absorb the moisture on the inner surface of the fabric, and on the outer surface, let it evaporate. And it needs to do this without holding water in. Cotton works very effective as a wicking fabric, but it also retains the water. So we have to, the best, most effective natural fiber are the fibers of merino wool. Merino sheep were bred in Spain to develop a very fine wool fabric, very comfortable. And now the sheep that develop that from which we can harvest this wool are found in Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. So this is the best natural fiber. But our chemists have been at work and have developed some polyester fibers that are very small, very effective at wicking. Now, the intentional cool microfiber, iCool, is the latest fiber and is the one that, if we look at the tests performed on perspiration and evaporation and heat exchange, this is the most effective fabric, but it's not on the market yet. So look for iCool coming soon. Merino wool fibers, of course, are the standard. Under Armour has purchased the Cool Switch microfiber, which is quite effective, and Dry Fit is the microfiber polyester fabric used by Nike. So some of these fabrics will help keep you cool by wicking the perspiration, transferring the heat from your body to the outer surface of the fabric where it's cooled from evaporation. Next. Now, the next thing is medicines. Alcohol is the first one you think, well, you get a cold drink, that might help you stay cool. Well, the cold might help cool you down, but alcohol is not a good choice. It makes you feel cool because it helps your capillaries dilate. So it gets the blood to the surface where you can, where the heat can be dissipated. But the problem is it's also a diuretic. So you lose body water. So you feel cool in the beginning. And then after a few hours of heat exposure, you're not going to have the fluid reserves to cope with the heat. So alcohol is one. Diuretics, stimulants, anticholinergics, and beta blockers. Next slide. Now, this is somewhat of a busy slide, but you'll see some of these drugs. If you know what you're on now, and you know what class that is, the antidepressants are here. The SSRIs, the serotonin release inhibitors, and and what these different drugs have different effects. Either they change your central nervous system so you're not as sensitive to the heat change, so you're not effectively responding to the heat that's around you, or it's interfering, like the anticholinergics, interfering with the actual rate in which you can perspire. Heart medications may change how your heart responds. You gotta have blood pumping to the surface in order to have this cooling mechanism from the perspiration. And insulin, the main problem with insulin is that if you expose your insulin to heat, it's going to become deactivated. So, next slide. Now, the next one is to know your weather. Now, the most commonly used term is the heat index. You see that in newspapers frequently. And this is a measure of a combination of the temperature and the humidity. Now, on athletic fields, the trainers use what they call a wet bulb globe temperature. And this is now mechanized. It used to be just taking a thermometer, a globe thermometer, wrapping it with a fabric, wetting the fabric, and then twirling this around. This is the way we did it 50 years ago to determine what the wet globe temperature was. And then you could make calculations on this amount of sun, the cloud cover, the humidity, wind speed, and you come out with a guideline on how well you can tolerate that heat. Now, there's something more recent that's available to all of us every day, and it's called AccuWeather Real Feel. Now, AccuWeather is a commercially available, like the Weather Channel. they forecast the weather any location around the world. They have data coming in from all over the world. So AccuWeather has developed this thing that they call real feel, which is basically the same thing as what the athletes are using. And it's a measure of temperature, humidity, wind speed, sun intensity, and cloud cover, all of which are important. Now, your brain tells you, well, if you're out in the sun and you're too hot, what do? Move into the shade, look for some shade. Well, that's nice if there's shade available. But it's nice to know ahead of time. Next slide. It's nice to know ahead of time exactly what your potential risk might be. So in order to, this gives us a scale of, for our competitive athletes, this extracts their guidelines to what I thought might be practical for you. If you have a real feel of 82 degrees or above, you need to be alert to your hydration status and the duration of your activities and the availability of water and breaks to
Real feel. What is that? I mean, how do I know if I'm integrated? How do you know that?
the question is how do I know about real feel? Well, you have to tune into AccuWeather. And yeah. So if you don't have it on your smartphone or whatever, you have to pay $20 a year for a subscription to AccuWeather to get the real feel. Yes. Another question.
Whether it says temperature, blah, blah, feels like, and then it gives another number, is that real feel?
The question is on your iPhone, you have, it feels like reading. I don't know. I haven't investigated that. I would assume that that's more like the heat index, where it is a combination of temperature and humidity. It doesn't take into effect the effect of the sun or the wind. Now, if your real feel index is between 82 and 87, that's basically what I was just saying. You need to be alert to the availability of water and the duration of your activities and how active you are. If it's 87 to 90, you need to limit the duration of your activities to 2 hours and make sure you have breaks every 15 minutes to rehydrate. Now, you can rehydrate every 15 minutes. You can take a glass of water. 8 ounces of water you can absorb every 15 or 20 minutes. For women, it may be 20 minutes. For men, could even be under 15 minutes. If it's 90 to 92, you need to limit your physical activity to 1 hour. And if it's over 90, if it's over 92, the real feel index, then cancel your outdoor plans. You need to stay indoors in the shade at least and have something cool to drink and stay relatively inactive. Now, this guideline, the key numbers are at the real feel number of 82 is kind of the threshold for being alert to the potential of heat exposure, of heat exhaustion. And 92 is the threshold for getting out of the sun and stay and forget your activities. Now, this scale may change. Now, if you're not fully hydrated, if you've been out the day before, you may be underhydrated. And the only way you know that is if you take your weight every day at the same time every day or before you go out. And if you're down more than 1% of your body weight, you are starting to become dehydrated. If you're more than 2% down, you really need to limit your activities and make sure you're drinking a lot. And if you're more than 3% down, you're in trouble and you may need to seek medical attention if you go out and do anything, because chances are high that you will have some sort of failure. And then if you're younger than 55, and are you acclimated to the heat? So all of these things, heat acclimation, age, hydration status, and the medication status, all would tend to lower these temperatures. So somebody my age who's on heart medicine or high blood pressure medicine, I may need to be alert to a real feel number of 80, 79 or 80. The whole scale shifts down by a few degrees. Next slide. So now here's what the real feel looks like on your computer or on your smartphone. You'll see the temperature on the left, and it says real feel. Like if I go down to 1 p.m., just above the white dot. Here, 1 p.m., the actual temperature, this is Gainesville a few days ago. It was 78 degrees in the shade. The real feel is 83. So you can see that, oh, this is at 2 p.m. Okay, the real feel was 84 degrees. So that's in the zone of being alert to our hydration status and activity level and how long we're out. Look at the difference between real feel in the shade. So obviously the easiest thing to do when you're outdoors, make sure you're working in the shade. And that's going to take you out of that critical zone of concern. Next slide. Now, if we look at, this is another day. This is the actual temperature, the white, solid white line. I'm sorry, right here. And now the dotted line here is the real feel. So starting about 10 a.m., we can see that the real feel temperature starts to become higher and higher as related to the actual temperature. So here at 2 p.m., the temperature is 72, was 72, the real feel was 79. And you can see it's actually reversed in the early morning hours. Your real feel is below what your ambient temperature is. Next slide. Now, another thing is to reschedule your routines. Benjamin Franklin, this is long time before even our Industrial Revolution was taking place, said early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Well, I can't argue with that. So it's sensible to develop two routines, one for our hot months, and I'm talking about Gainesville. We have 7 hot months from April to November. And, or is it April? Yeah, April to November. And 5 cold months, December, January, February. Oh, well, what? March. Yeah, March. Thank you for that assistance. We get an assist on this goal, and have one routine for your cold months, but have an earlier routine in the day for your hot months. And what you want to do is shift your outdoor activities to pre-dawn and early morning, and basically be done with your activities by 10 a.m. And this is kind of what a lot of us have learned to do in the summer when we go out gardening. We get up early and do it in the morning and get inside by midday. And then eating your largest meal at midday so that then you can go to bed early and likewise. So I don't know how this ties in with daylight savings time, whether it links up or not. I haven't examined that, but our actual activity time outdoors should change with the seasons. Next slide. Now this is kind of fun. This the y-axis denotes the time of day, starting at 12 a.m. This is noon, and this is midnight. And then this is the month of the year, starting with January and going all the way through February. So our hottest months are here: April, May, June, July, August, September, October. And you can see midday and early afternoon, and in the summer, even into the evening and into the real early morning time is when it's uncomfortably warm. And the hottest time is going to be in the summer months. June, July, and August are right here, June, July, and August. And the time frame between noon and about 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening. So this kind of gives you, when you're planning your routines for your season, and this may have to do with, I don't know, when you go fishing or whatever your activities are, or if you're going to take a vacation, this is very helpful to have kind of a bird's eye view of the need to change your schedule. Next slide. Now, what about location? Is Gainesville in a good spot? Is it too hot? Is it too cold? Or is it just right? Next slide. Now, the scientists have looked at the population densities and where people were living in 1980. Most people lived in areas where the average temperature was between 45 and 63 degrees Fahrenheit. Now that's the average daily temperature. It's a combination of night and day. The greatest population density occurs at 55 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's interesting when you look at the amount of agricultural activity, the income from agricultural products and from industrial activities, this is where people can work most effectively and efficiently. So these tend to be the wealthier areas of the world. Now, there's a second density concentration between 73 and 80 degrees. Instead of 55, it focuses on this. And this is where there are semi-tropical areas where there's heavy rainfall. And almost no one lives in areas where the average annual temperature exceeds 84 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, where is Gainesville in all this? You look at the population, we're right on the threshold, the early threshold of this secondary density area where we have a rainy season, but the other has warm temperatures. So if you look at Gainesville's average temperature in the summer is 83 degrees. Wow, that's almost close to this 84. Well, no wonder everybody leaves Gainesville in the summer. We don't need scientists to tell us that. I mean, it's just human beings don't want to be outdoors in the summer in Gainesville. But 62 degrees is closer to this ideal area. So 7 months out of the year, Gainesville's in a good place. So when you look at the other parameters besides temperature, you know, tornadoes, floods, hurricanes, all these other concerns that people have, forest fires, Gainesville is actually a relatively good place to live. Next slide. So as the temperature is rising, right now we're 1.5 degrees centigrade above that normal baseline that right around the turn of the century in 1900. this is where we are right now in terms of how favorable is it as a place to live. And you can see that much of our country is in the green zone, very, very favorable. And as time goes on, that green is going to move up, upwards. But it's interesting that Florida doesn't change a whole lot in color. I don't have a explanation for that, but it's fun to look at when you're planning your retirement and you think you want to live in a place that's more comfortable. This is the kind of thing that you can look at. Yeah, the sea breeze. Yeah, that's another thing. Next slide. Now, what the other concern here in Florida is our young people who are competing athletically outdoors. And in 2017, there was a high school student, a junior, 16-year-old high school student named Zachary Martin, who was going to school at Riverdale High School in Fort Myers. And he played football for the Riverdale Raiders. He was 6'4", 330 pounds. He was an interior lineman. And on a day in August in 2017, he was out exercising with his teammates. They were running wind sprints in the sun, and he collapsed. And he made it to the hospital. He was never removed from being in the sun on the athletic field. The rescue unit took him to the hospital, and pretty much his brain was fried, and he died a few days later. But his mom was a go-getter, especially after the following month, another student in the Tampa area died. Another high school student playing football died. The interesting thing is that the other high-risk sport is cross-country running, both for men and women. And I witnessed this firsthand as a sports physician when I was working with the University of Florida. But there was a law passed in 2020 called the Zachary Martin Act, and it did a number of things. It provided training for coaches and athletic staff and training staff as to guidelines for when to be out and how much to exercise and how often to take water breaks and so forth. And how to make sure that athletes are hydrated. The best schools weigh the athletes before and after their exercise period to see how much they're dehydrated. So on a day-to-day basis, the athletes can supplement what's given to them on the field, because it's not only important what they receive on the field in terms of hydration, it's also, especially the first hour or two after athletic activity or after you're outdoors, to restore your hydration status. And then they also offered and included requirements to have an ice water immersion bath present. And just so you, next slide. This looks like a watering trough for horses. And that works well too, a galvanized water trough for horses or cattle. But this is big enough to actually put somebody in where they would have an ice slush bath. And that's the most effective thing after the fact when somebody on the athletic field starts showing the symptoms of heat stroke, exertional heat stroke. And that's where the body temperature is rising over 104. And it makes sense that for the coaches to follow these guidelines, because as your body temperature rises, the efficiency and strength of your muscle activity declines. So once the body reaches, I don't know, 99 something, close to 100, then your muscle strength and endurance starts dissipating. So it makes sense to keep the athletes cool. Next slide. Now, the other thing, what about? Yes.
About the impact of that legislation on coaches and athletic trainers, are they now legally responsible in a way that they were not before?
Yeah, the question is, coaches and trainers now legally responsible. I don't think that changed the legal status, but except that now this is a bench line of expected behavior by the coaches and trainers. So if they fail to follow these guidelines, then they would be more vulnerable to criticism and possible litigation. So I think that's a good point. The guidelines that they use now in Florida are almost identical to the ones used in the state of Georgia, which makes sense. They have the same problem we do. Since that legislation was passed, there has not been one death of a high school athlete from exertional heat stroke. I'm not sure about whether or not there's been any emergency care having to be rendered, but at least it is saving lives. But across the country, not all states have good laws now that Florida has, and about 2 high school athletes every year die from exertional heat stroke. So that's kind of the level of significance. Now, when we look at outdoor workers, the immigrant farmers who are out there harvesting strawberries and tomatoes and our usual crops, they're also vulnerable to heat exhaustion. And likewise, there have been several deaths here in Florida. Across the country, there are about 40 deaths that are recorded due to exertional heat stroke among farm laborers. Well, our House and Senate here in the state of Florida have developed a proposed legislation. It's now been proposed for the last 3 years, and the bills have been drawn up. And as of this year, I was hopeful that this might be passed. Our local senator, Senator Keith Perry, is one of the sponsors of this legislation for farm laborers and other outdoor workers. It would provide mandatory education for employers and employees who are working outdoors, outdoor work requirements for water and shade. The federal government does not have any requirements. NIOSH has some recommendations, but there are no requirements, federal requirements. And on March 8th, just 2 weeks ago, or 1 week ago, this bill died in the House in the Economic Development Subcommittee. So there's resistance by employers and farmers, and you can imagine their margins are probably pretty narrow, their profit margins, and they don't want to anything where they have to slow down the work of these laborers and allow them to get into the shade and provide water for them. That's all they have to do, provide shade and water periodically for the workers, using a scale similar to the one you saw, the 82 real field to 92 degree. But it won't pass the state of Florida. So if there's any place where we can focus, and I'm going to call up Senator Perry's office and see if there's anything I can do to help this along. So this is what this is just next slide. This is the population that is vulnerable here in Florida, and every year we lose 2 or 3 farm laborers here in the state of Florida. It is real, and it's here. Next slide. And if you want to read further and enjoy something, a book that it will scare you some, but it will also give you an idea of what's happening around the world. Jeff Goodell is a science writer, and he takes vignettes from actual examples from all around the world, Pakistan, Middle East, California, wherever, about what's happening, and it kind of gives you an idea of what the rest of the planet is suffering. Next slide. So that's the end of the talk. Now I want to open it to questions.
Feel free to walk up to the microphone. Great job.
All right, thank you.
And I will throw one question at you, and I'm assuming that we are increasing. Oh, okay. I'm assuming that we are actually becoming hotter and hotter. It's not as if that we've already found a benchmark that we're going to stop at. And so I'm a little bit worried about how about the boa constrictors down in the far south of the Everglades? And I've heard that one has made it up to Orlando, and I'm assuming that as the heat gets hotter, that we'll have more of those snakes that we worry about coming up closer and closer to us. What's your attitude about that?
I think this is evolutionary biology right in hand. We're returning to the age of the reptiles. Remember, these cold-blooded animals do very well in temperatures that are 10 or 15 degrees warmer than where we're comfortable. So having reptile and how about the iguanas falling out of the trees in the cold weather in Miami? All of these creatures, we will be seeing more. We'll be seeing more reptiles in Florida. So that's how I see it.
I have a comment. I look at this from a somewhat different perspective. I run a bluebird trail project at the village. Last summer, did you say that which month was the hottest ever recorded?
July.
That was a peak of our activity last year in July. We found bluebirds nesting there in good numbers through May. They start actually in April, May, June. Suddenly in July, they normally have 3 broods, and the second and third would be done in July. In July, we saw nothing from those bluebirds. They were not able to do that. Now I know why. They suffered intensely from the heat, and that was reflected in our observations. And we were out there trying to monitor the situation in the full middle of the day, and we had trouble functioning, and we weren't paying attention to heat and very much of anything. So this is a very interesting cautionary tale. It's going to be different this year, believe me. Thanks.
We're going to the beach in July.
I know you've included, of course, the humidity is very important, but I wonder about moving air, in other words, wind or inside fans and that kind of thing. How is that? Is it calculated into this at all?
They just use the rate of evaporation from a surface of water in terms of determining the effect of the wind on the cooling. So that if people are stationary, I mean, when you're riding a bicycle going 20 miles an hour, you get a wind effect. You create your own wind, and it's cooling. It helps evaporate the perspiration on your forehead. So I think the scientists just use the rate of evaporation, and I don't know if how the sun. I think the sun is primarily a radiant. Sun exposure is a radiant heat phenomenon. There may be some effect, I don't know, of the sun actually on the rate of evaporation on the surface of water. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but very nice reef. Yeah, those are all refinements. Yes.
Would you hand it to me?
Sure.
when I moved here about 15 years ago, I went through the nature training, and I developed a butterfly garden, and it was not uncommon for me to have monarch butterflies settle into my house at the rate of just staggering. And one year I had 70 chrysalises in my backyard. So I was a super hot butterfly gardener. Okay. I am trying to do butterfly gardening right now in an apartment complex. I'm lucky, and I'm good at butterfly gardening. I'm lucky if I get 10 butterflies. It's tragic. And I used to watch crows, and there was a population of about 16 crows with these crows that I watched. And now it's down to 3. I have had a stroke, which is why I have trouble talking coherently, because part of my brain is destroyed. But I tend to like animals more than I do people. And when I do work myself, I try to save animals. And what's happening to animals devastates me. It breaks my heart. So there you go.
Yeah, I appreciate the comment. I think the animals around us, as well as the plants around us, are indicative of our changing environment. And
They just from the most common tough butterfly plants are struggling right now.
and plants are also moving northward. And obviously there's a dynamic interaction between the animal, the fauna and the flora. And so all of these observations tie into the increased level of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. Thank you. Okay, well, thank you. Thanks for that. And thank you, Holden. Appreciate your service. Yeah. Very good. Wow, so the bluebirds. Get me those slides. Oh, yeah, I can send them to you. Yeah.